suspects are being one case involves. The FBI is now offering $100,000 to see if the police are releasing marathon.
Welcome to Missy Mysteries. I'm your host Keely, and this is a paranormal and true crime podcast. Today's story is a very classic and well-known family haunting. I'm going to be telling you the story of the Perron family haunting, also known as the Ranch House haunting in Harrisville, Rhode Island, that inspired the first Conjuring movie. During my research for this topic, I mainly use interviews and videos from people who have lived in the house, such as the Perrons, the Sutcliffes, or the current owners and paranormal investigators Corey and Jennifer Hines, who are currently selling the home. Today's story starts in the winter of 1970, when Carolyn and Roger Perron moved their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, into a large ranch home named the Arnold Estate, that the parents actually changed to the Old Arnold Estate. The oldest Perron daughter, Andrea, who was just 12 years old when they moved into the home, says that their connection started 2 years before they actually moved, when her father Roger brought home a puppy that she explained was the most special puppy she has ever had, and though the puppy was supposed to be the family's dog, it was really more of hers. On the day that Roger brought the puppy home, Carolyn wrapped the puppy in her arms and said this is a very special puppy who needs a special name to match. She closed her eyes and out of nowhere she came up with the name Bathsheba, which we know now relates to their experience in the home, but in the moment just seemed like a really weird name that they hadn't heard before. Sadly, Bathsheba the puppy never made it to the Old Arnold Estate, but this wasn't the last event that connected them before the move. The Perrons' process of moving began in 1968 to 1969, when the neighborhood children started to cause trouble, and even one day breaking into the Perron family home while they were on vacation, kidnapping 2 of their cats, and sadly ending the life of Andrea's cat. Andrea, in response to losing not only her dog Bathsheba, but her cat that she used to escape the death of her dog, began to go down a dark path. It got to a point where she had beaten up the kid responsible for the death of her cat, to the point where Roger had to appear in court to explain Andrea's actions. Tension really rose in the neighborhood after this, and Carolyn started to worry about her daughter's safety. Carolyn wouldn't let them play outside of the backyard. They had to walk the girls to and from school for their safety. Carolyn expressed to Roger that she wanted to move out to the city to a safer countryside home, and it wasn't too long after this that Carolyn found the Old Arnold Estate. Carolyn actually found the home through an ad in a newspaper, and surprisingly was the only person to respond to this ad in the 6 months it had been in the paper. On the day Carolyn found the ad for the home, she had taken Andrea to a flute lesson that was about an hour long. Knowing how long the lesson was, Carolyn grabbed a newspaper to read while waiting, but she didn't get to read the newspaper till she had gotten her alone time after the girls had gone to bed that night. When she opened this paper, it was as if the advertisement listing the home for sale just jumped out at her. At 9:30 that night, she called the realtor in charge of the sale, and the realtor helped her set up a tour for that very next morning. Carolyn left that morning without telling anyone, leaving the girls with the babysitter, and after looking at the house, she emptied the family's bank account of $500 to hold the farm till Roger got back, leaving only enough money in cash for bread and milk and just enough to leave the bank account open. Roger was a traveling jewelry and fine clothes salesman and didn't know what his wife had done till he got back from his business trip, and he immediately was trying to get his money back. He knew they couldn't afford to buy a 200-acre estate, but Carolyn convinced him to just take a look at the house because she knew he would fall in love with it too. Roger and Carolyn packed up all 5 girls and headed to the property. Sure enough, all of them had fallen in love with the house and the property itself. The Perron family bought this home in December of 1970 and didn't actually move in until January 11th, 1971. This was mostly because Carolyn didn't want to move the family during Christmas time, and the owner they had bought it from, Earl Kenyon, or as the Perron daughters call him, Mr. Kenyon, wasn't ready to leave the house. He had only sold the house because his son felt he needed to be in a more accessible place with his health and his age. Mr. Kenyon was the 8th generation of his family to be in the home, dating all the way back to before the Declaration of Independence. The land that the old Arnold estate sits on was deeded to the Richardson family in 1680 after they followed Roger Williams, who founded the Rhode Island colony after he separated from Massachusetts Bay Colony due to his belief that there should be both religious freedom and separation of church and state. The property was originally surveyed by John Smith, one of the original British colonists, well known for his relationship with Pocahontas and the indigenous tribes of America. This land was actually more than 1,000 acres when deeded to the Richardson family. At this time, women could not own property, but to keep the property in the Richardson family line, they deeded the property to the Richardson family husbands, which then changed the name to the Arnold family name. The home we know as the Conjuring home was built in 1736, 40 years before the Declaration of Independence. This means that before the Perron family ever saw or moved into this home saw the Revolutionary War, the start of America, the Civil War, the Great Depression, and so many more historical events, including the personal history of 8 generations of just one family. Now that we know more of the history, let's jump back to the Perron family move-in day. This is actually the day that the paranormal activity started for the family. Andrea, the oldest Perron daughter, said that there was a very intense swirling snowstorm that day, but when you are a good old hardy Yankee from New England and it's moving day, you damn well move on moving day. The family arrived at the home, and Carolyn brought April inside with her because she was just too little to help, only being 5 years old, but the rest of the girls were told to help. Roger handed Andrea a large box and told her to take the box to her mother in the kitchen. She went to the closest door, which led to the parlor. She turned right into the living room from the parlor, where she saw Mr. Kenyon was packing the rest of his stuff left in the built-in cabinet, but Mr. Kenyon wasn't alone. She saw a man standing in the corner watching Mr. Kenyon pack. She told this man good morning because her parents had taught her to be very polite to adults, and went into the kitchen where her mom was unpacking their stuff and packing Mr. Kenyon's stuff with their empty boxes. She asked her mother who the man was with Mr. Kenyon, and Carolyn told her there was no one with him. His son was coming to help, but he wasn't there yet. Christine then walks in and mentions the man with Mr. Kenyon was just funny. Cindy walks in not too long after Christine and also mentions the funny dressed man. Annoyed at this point, Carolyn tells the girls there is no man with Mr. Kenyon. That's when Nancy walked into the kitchen and remembers leaning over to Sydney and saying, "Did you see that man with Mr. Kenyon?" "I did. He just disappeared." A few hours after this event, towards the end of the day, Mr. Kenyon was in the dining room, still packing up some of his things, and Roger had noticed he really didn't seem like he wanted to leave the home. Roger offered Mr. Kenyon a room in the house, since there was more than enough rooms, and they had really come to love Mr. Kenyon, and Mr. Kenyon had really come to love them. Mr. Kenyon, though, had to turn him down, telling him he couldn't because his son had already made him a house on his property and really took the effort to have his dad close to him. Roger then offered Mr. Kenyon the barn for storage till springtime, when it warmed up a little bit, to make the move easier on him. At this point, the 4 girls, Andrea, Christine, Nancy, and Sydney, were in the dining room with Roger and Mr. Kenyon, warming up since it was one of the only warm rooms in the house. When Roger offered this to Mr. Kenyon, the man the girls saw earlier in the day reappeared, but only the girls could see him. Roger and Mr. Kenyon couldn't. The girls shared these looks, and they just knew that they were seeing all the same thing. Andrea described this man as being old but young at the same time. He was dressed in what she thought was weird clothes as a kid, but now can identify them as 1850s farm clothes. They never found out who this man was because he never walked up and introduced himself. But Nancy, not being very creative with names at this age, saw that he was a man and named him Manny. The girls saw Manny often. He would just hang out in the house with the family as if he was a very close family friend. After they spoke to Carolyn about their experiences with Manny, she believed that this man was named John or Johnny Arnold, who lived in the home. He was the son of Edwin Arnold, and in her research of the history of the home, found that he had crawled into the eaves of the home, drinking horse ligament, and it's very unclear if he drank this to get buzzed or to take his own life, but it made him horribly sick, taking his own life while he was still in the eaves of the home. Andrea says that her mother did end up finding an empty bottle of the horse ligament in the eaves during the 10 years that they did live in the home, but this doesn't mean that it was the bottle he drank out of. John Arnold had lived in the home during his early years in life since he lived with his father Edwin, who owned the home. He did end up completing suicide in 1911, but his obituary reads, John A. Arnold died at his home in Tarkland. For several years, he had not been in good health and latterly became despondent. In the fit of despondency, he took a dose of Paris green, and in the efforts of a physician to save his life, was unavailing. His home he did pass away in was miles away from the old Arnold estate, and cause of death seemed to be self-inflicted, after he took a dose of Paris green, a very poisonous green pigment that was used in paint, wallpaper, and fabric. This man that they call Manny could still be Johnny, as the parents do believe. Maybe he came to the place he lived early in life, or it could be another man of the Arnold family that lived in the home during the early years. With more history of who Manny maybe could be, let's jump back again to the moving day since there's more experiences. Just before Mr. Kenyon left the home, he took Roger on a walk around the property to have a talk about the house. He told Roger during this walk that for the sake of his family to leave the lights on at night. Roger didn't fully understand what he meant by this. He thought it was because all 5 girls would be sleeping upstairs in bedrooms, while Roger and Carolyn slept downstairs with the only bathroom at the time. So he thought leaving the lights on would help to make sure the girls didn't fall down or trip on the steep and narrow stairs. Mr. Kenyon never really explained what he meant when he said this, but the family did later find out by neighbors that when Mr. Kenyon lived there, you would never pass the home at night without every light on. Mr. Kenyon came back to visit the Perrons a few times, but he never mentioned any ghost experiences or hauntings he had. The only hint that he ever experienced a haunting was what he said to Roger in one conversation he had with Carolyn while visiting the family. Carolyn told Mr. Kenyon that she had been hearing noises at night. He winked at her and just said, "Swallows in the chimney." I want to note that Mr. Kenyon, when the Perrons moved in, had actually sealed off every single fireplace. So it's interesting that he said swallows in the chimney. A significant part of this case is just how quick the paranormal experiences in this home started, starting from day one and not ending until they left in June of 1980. The girls started to experience hauntings from the very first day, and a lot of them seemed to be targeted in their bedrooms. Their beds would vibrate during the night. The girls would explain that every morning when they woke up, their beds would be in a different spot than when they went to bed. It was just a normal thing every morning to move it back and not really say anything about it. Their legs and blankets would be tugged on in the middle of the night. Their toys and belongings would be played with or hidden to the point where it would sometimes start fights between them because they would think their sisters were messing with their belongings. The girls at night would feel a woman kiss them goodnight, and they knew it wasn't Carolyn because the woman smelled like fruit and flowers, which wasn't their mother's smell. They could hear the sounds of doors opening and closing, in particular the cellar door, and they would get weird feelings in the hallway where the cellar door was. Nancy would always run through the hallway to avoid that cellar door. They heard footsteps around the house, the sound of door latches to the point where they memorized the different door latch sounds, bangs throughout the house, and a child who would call Mama in the middle of the night. There seemed to be an overall unexplained sadness that affected the girls and Carolyn and others who were in the house for long enough. At some point in Andrea's book, it was never really said, but it did seem like she hinted that the girls may have had sexual assaults by the spirits in the home. They never talk about the spirit besides one quote from Andrea saying, "Let's just say there was one really bad male spirit in the home with a house full of little girls." And these are just the general experiences for the girls living in the home. The girls lived with anxiety. They would never tell who they were encountering throughout the day. No one would go to the bathroom alone, and if you had to go to the bathroom alone, you would leave the door open. When it comes down to the individual Perron family members, how they feel about the house today and what they experience for themselves vary by who is telling this story. One of the more lighthearted haunts at the home was April's experience. She found a friend in the home. All of the girls saw her friend in the form of their toys moving, but April had a special connection to the spirit that she hid for over 30 years. In the home was what they called a warm room. This was always the warmest room in the house because of how the chimney ran through the house, left a little closet that April loved to play in. As a kid, I think I would have loved this room too, especially if it was snowing or cold outside. The warm room had 2 doors on each side that connected the closets attached to the girls' bedrooms, kind of making this little fort-like cave situation. April was the only kid who didn't go to school for a little bit after moving into the home, and she spent a lot of time in the house. She made a little town with her toys in the warm room. One day, while she was playing, one of the doors opened, and a little pale blonde boy with watery green eyes appeared. She said, "Oh, hello," and the boy looked around, making sure no one was behind him, before introducing himself as Oliver Richardson. But he didn't vocally say his name. He talked to her telepathically. She would talk to Oliver and play with Oliver in the warm room. Oliver took special interest in her toys. She explained that he would sit there in amazement and just examine her toys. April loved playing with Oliver, and she actually was very upset when paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren came to pay a visit to their house in fear that they would make him go away. Now, Christine, her experience was a little bit more different than April. Christine at one point was taking a nap upstairs when the rest of the family was in the kitchen making sandwiches for lunch. They had realized that they didn't know where Christine was and went to search for her. They found her upstairs, locked in a box, crying and screaming for someone to get her out. When they got her out of the box, she was so mad at her mother, asking her why she had put her in this box. But Carolyn had been downstairs with the other girls this whole time making sandwiches. What Christine remembers about this was waking up, but she couldn't move her or open her eyes. She heard her mother's voice telling her to get in the box, and she was then picked up and placed in the box. Not only was Carolyn with the other girls, but the box Christine was put in was always called the antique trunk by her mother, not the box. Andrea, the oldest, and to this day the most vocal, but happened to her family, writing a book and going on many paranormal investigation shows and YouTube channels, that seemed to have a lot easier time in the home than some of her sisters. When she wanted to be alone, she would just simply tell them, "Leave me alone, I'm busy," and they would not bother her. As the oldest, she really had to step up when her mom was struggling with her health and kind of act like the mother for her sisters. Andrea's experiences a lot of times included her sisters or even experiencing her mother's experiences. Andrea would hear the sound of an old horn in her bedroom at night that she kind of chalked up to being the wind since it was such an old home, and the girls had to leave all the doors connecting their room open to really get any heat circulating through their rooms and through the home. She also would see a family with a father, mother, 2 kids, and a dog that would stand there staring at the wall, never acknowledging any of the Perron family. Andrea believes that this is more of a residual haunting, staring at what maybe could have been a window at the time. And this kind of goes into what is called the blueprint theory that I will cover in a later episode. But as a brief explanation, it is the thought that the spirits in the home, being residual, may stare at walls or windows or walk through what looks like could have been a door, but now it's a wall, because this is how the home was set up when they were alive. And there's more to it, but again, I'll cover it on a later episode. Now, one of the worst experiences Andrea had in the home was one that she experienced with her mother. Andrea woke up one night and could hear her mother screaming, but she was stuck in a sleep paralysis state. She couldn't get to her mother. During this state, she went into what she described as an out-of-body experience, where she was looking down into her mother and father's room. In the room, she saw a woman floating near her parents' dresser. She was wearing a gray dress with a belt, and lace around her neck. Her head was hanging off of her neck, and her face had no features. Her eye sockets and nose holes were hollow and had what looked like cobwebs in them. She had jagged yellow teeth and was moving towards Carolyn. As Carolyn was kicking her away while screaming, Roger, sleeping right next to her, was not waking up. She even started to pull his hair, trying to wake him up. At this point, it seemed like Roger was dead. And when Carolyn pulled the blanket off of him, she saw he had scratches. Her first thought was, "Oh my God, he has been clawed to death." And in this moment, she was begging God for help. When she turned back around to where the broken neck lady was, she was gone. And at this point, Andrea could finally break free from her sleep paralysis, and she used that to run downstairs and find her mom. Downstairs, she found her mom sitting on the couch with a pencil and paper, shaking. Carolyn had a cup of coffee that Andrea went to drink out of, and when she did, she saw her mom drawing the lady she just saw, and knew what happened was real. Carolyn asked her not to say anything to her sisters, and before she went back upstairs, she noticed the grandfather clock had stopped at 5:15 a.m. 5:15 was the time for the family that seemed to be their witching hour. At 5:15, they would start to smell rotten flesh, and all their clocks would stop. This broken neck lady did not only go to Carolyn. Unfortunately, Sydney was the child who seemed to get the worst of the hauntings out of all the girls, and had her own experiences with this broken neck lady. Andrea shared that Cindy had actually died when she was 2 months old while having health problems and was brought back to life. And because of this near-death experience, the spirits may have been able to get closer to her than the rest of the girls. Cindy's haunting began right away. The second night living in the home, while in her bed, she woke up to 7 to 8 voices all around her bed, telling her there are 7 dead soldiers buried in the walls. These voices repeated it over and over, getting louder and louder each time. And she didn't understand why no one was hearing these voices, especially Christine, who shared the room with her. Terrified of these voices, she ran into Andrea's room and asked her if she could sleep in the bed with her. Andrea thought nothing much of this, being the older sister, and she thought she just got cold or Christine's sleep talking scared her. But got really worried for Cindy when she explained what really happened to her that night. These voices repeated this event over 1,000 times while the Perrons lived in the home. Cindy was tormented in this home, especially in her own bed. Her bed would elevate off the floor, sliding and slamming onto the floor. She also had one night where she was dragged by her feet down into the cellar. One day when she was playing in the room by herself, she saw the closet door open. She watched the door, waiting for one of her sisters to come out, but instead the broken neck lady came out of the closet. She started to talk to Cindy, looking at her, asking her to come to her, and walking towards her. Cindy was screaming for help and even remembers being so mad at her mom because her mom did not come to help. This house seems to have a way of blocking out people's screams and throwing their voices in different places of the home. Unfortunately, without hearing any of this, Carolyn and Roger had no idea what was happening to their daughters. Andrea didn't want to tell their mother because she didn't want to bother her when she was going through her own stuff. And they felt they couldn't turn to Roger since he was having a hard time believing Carolyn. They felt like he would never believe them. The girls were able to keep their experiences to themselves to about 6 months into living in the home, when Andrea felt they needed to tell Carolyn. Carolyn immediately told Andrea to get her sisters, except April, who was sleeping and was too young. And Carolyn just listened to the girls about their experiences till 1 a.m. Even though she had been experiencing her own activity, she used this opportunity to just let her daughters talk. At first, Carolyn's experiences started with one ghost who would move things around, especially the broom. She would hear the broom move and she'd hear it sweeping, and if she left the room for long enough, she would come back to piles of dirt on the floor as if someone had swept. Then her hair started to get pulled and legs tugged on. She would hear noises around the house, such as scraping, and one very common noise was banging on the front door, to the point where she thought it may break. Her and Roger both would wake up at 5:15 a.m. to smells of rotting flesh. The home had a horrible bat and crow infestation, And worst of all, in the dead of winter, they would have an overwhelming amount of botflies in the home. They even had an exterminator come out twice for them, but he had no idea where these botflies were breeding or coming from. Once they started to talk about their experiences, all these flies dropped dead in large numbers at the same time. Lorraine Warren explained the flies as a warning of what was going to come, which is why they would drop dead once they started talking about the activity in the home. Andrew believes that the activity in the home ramped up, especially towards her mother, when she opened a fireplace in the parlor room. When they moved into the home, all the fireplaces were closed, and Mr. Kenyon never explained it. But the house was so cold, and it was always cold, that one day when the girls were at school, Carolyn and April opened the fireplace in hopes to warm the house up a bit. Shortly after this, Carolyn's first experience in the home came. She wanted to check out the barn after April was down for a nap, because she and Roger had promised the girls a horse when it started to warm up in the spring. She remembers the barn as being freezing cold, and the barn at this point only had one working light bulb, which left it pretty dark, even with the light on. After turning on the light, Carolyn remembers hearing a whooshing sound, and her first thought was that a bird had gotten stuck up there, but when she looked up to the main support beam, all she saw was a knife coming down at her. The knife came down and sliced her side of the neck, going down to her chest. Luckily, this moment, it was so cold that she had 4 layers of clothes and Roger's thick leather bomber jacket on. Although it did bruise her neck, even through all these layers, and knocked her down to the floor, she was just in shock about what had happened to her. Carolyn just didn't know what to think about it and what had happened to her in general. And sadly, this was far from the last time Carolyn was physically attacked by the spirits in the home. When Carolyn was in the shower one day, a neighbor stopped by the house to drop off cake and have some coffee with Carolyn. After the girls had set up the coffee, they sat with the neighbor, patiently waiting for the mother to get dressed so they can eat cake. When they heard Carolyn screaming, all the girls and the neighbor ran to go see what was wrong. After Carolyn had dropped her towel, one of the wooden hangers in the room where she was getting dressed had started to fly at her, almost as if someone was beating her with it on her head, chest, and arms. Their neighbor was terrified by what she had just saw and left the home, never coming back. Carolyn was left beaten, covered in bruises, and the girls were terrified because they just watched their mother get beaten by something they couldn't see. Carolyn was being targeted by something in the house that clearly did not want her there. Attacks on her became very regular. One of the spirit's favorite attacks was to stab her in the legs with what looked like a needle. When these attacks started to worsen, it really took a toll on Carolyn. She was tired all the time. She never really had an appetite to eat, which caused her to lose weight rapidly. And she started to age rapidly as well, at only 29 years old. Many blame the needle stabs in particular as the cause for Carolyn's decline in health. And this will become one of the reasons that Lorraine Warren brings up a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, which you will recognize as what they named their dog 2 years before they moved into the house. I know I have brought up Lorraine Warren a couple of times in this episode and haven't really explained where the Warrens come in yet. I'm going to be splitting this episode into a part 2, and next week I'm going to be explaining exactly where the Warrens come into this situation, the progressive attacks on Carolyn, and just deep diving more into the difference between what happened to them in real life and what happened in the movies. For now, I am thankful you listened to this episode today, and I truly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please let me know on Missy Mysteries social media. You can find the podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you would like, Missy Mysteries has a merch store with some awesome merch, and I also have a Patreon where there's 2 tiers, and it includes 2 additional episodes a month. I hope you all have an amazing week and an amazing start to your weekend. Please stay hydrated, get lots of rest, and I will see you next week. Bye!